Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for caring about open source. Thank you for caring about open data. The talk today is about openstates.org and building open data for the commons as a VC-backed startup. So my name is Jesse Mortenson. I am the CTO of Plural and the Open States project. I'm a Minnesotan. I'm a knocker of doors. What I'm doing with this company is I'm walking the tightrope of combining my passion with my paycheck, which is very cool for me. It also sometimes fraught. Folks in the open source world, you probably experienced some of this. I actually have, we talk about that passion. I have some history doing politics, trying to change the world around me, knocked on a bunch of doors, I've collected a bunch of signatures, I've sat through long city council meetings, so mostly working at the local level as a volunteer, trying to move policy forward in different ways. But like I said, I've done all that as a volunteer, and my professional background is in web stuff. Started a long time ago with a small, very tiny web company that I started as a young person, running websites off of a box in somebody's basement, running Apache, right, like a long, long time ago. So shout out to SourceForge, shout out to PHP, shout out to Drupal, all of which was kind of my gateway into open source and open source communities. So it feels very cool to be here and very cool to be part of this community so many years later. If you are confused at all about the name that you see when I say I'm the CTO of Plural, well, that's because we just launched a new brand 2 weeks ago. So if you saw the description, you're like, wait a second, what happened to Civic Eagle? We just rebranded. If you are not confused, then never mind. All right, so I'm imagining a lot of folks here are based in the US and are familiar with our federal system of government. If you're not, in the US we give a lot of power to individual states to do policy making. And that means that people have thought about the states as laboratories of democracy. This is a famous paraphrase from a Supreme Court justice. The idea that we've got folks in individual states trying out different policies and seeing if they work. And sometimes that looks like this. I think this person is trying to cure cancer, if I remember the source. And sometimes they look like this. And whether it looks like one or the other may depend on your political views, your experiences, how you analyze things. But I think we can all agree that it's pretty clear in the US that the ability to see what's going on, it matters. It matters a lot because state level policy and the intersections between state and federal policy make huge impacts. Whether that's in the wake of a Supreme Court decision, whether that's in the wake of federal inaction around something like climate change, censorship in schools, immigration and immigrant rights. The policy that people make in the halls of government impacts people's lives in really big ways, really profound ways. And a lot of times the folks that are impacted don't have a voice in making that policy. So there's a big question in a system like this, which is who keeps track of the experiments? If all these laboratories are working on policy, who's keeping track of what impact, what works, or even what's being tried? Is there anybody out there that's doing that work? Let's take a quick trip back in time. So the year is 2009, and to try and do that work, what you're doing is you're clicking through 50 government websites. Again, United States federal system, lots of devolved power to the states. There's no federal standard for open data coming out of states. Obviously there's piece here, piece there. The feds might require something, but for how legislation happens at the state level, nothing. So from Alabama to Illinois, you're looking at websites that are an extreme hodgepodge. It's the Wild West out there. And that leaves people with unhappiness. It was sadness, because somebody's got to keep track of all these experiments. And how do you do that if you can't even see, you don't have transparency around what's even happening, let alone what the impact of all that is? The good news is, then open states happened. There was a real need. It was obvious to so many people that that level of transparency was essential. Open states happened in 2009. And fast forward to the future, to where we are now, where we've been for a little while. The good news is that you can search a single resource to find out what's going on with these laboratories of democracy around the country. You can query an API, that's an open public API. You can download and analyze bulk data. You can just go to the website, search a bill, find a bill that you've heard in the news, learn about it, and figure out who's sponsoring it, what committee it might be going to. And that's Open States. It's something I'm really proud to be a part of because it is the best and oldest source of US legislative data. And it's really an honor for me, especially like, hey, I'm not the founder, right? I come later on, we'll get to that part. But it's an honor to work on something that millions of people touch. Obviously, there are people in this convention who work on sites with a lot more people touching those websites, but especially when it's democracy. This is millions of people trying to find out about policy, about bills. This is pretty arcane stuff. So just like seeing that we have millions of people trying to find out who represents them, what is that bill that I heard about, it's a precious thing. Serious engagement with democracy, even when it's very amateur, even when sometimes we look at it and say, wow, this is a crackpot who's just coming out of the woodwork, right? But this individual engagement with democracy is a really precious thing. I take that really seriously. In addition, we have a lot of organizations that depend on Open States. My colleague Riley yesterday made the point that Open States is critical infrastructure if you care about policymaking in the US. It is underpinning, that open data underpins so many different organizations that are either pulling it in to do advocacy work, pulling it in to do journalism, to do academic research, or even just citizens group stuff. Inside of our company, Plural, part of our vision is that we're working for the heroes of democracy. We're trying to build tools and data for the heroes of democracy. And that's a broad category, but we try to keep these folks in mind as we do our work. So I like to just sit with that for a moment and really take in the impact of this kind of data. And again, I don't take personal credit for it. This is a project that started in 2009, right? So we're here to steward this project and advance it, and it's a great privilege to do so. Just a few quotes. Recently, we did a summit for the project back in early January, and we reached out to some people who are kind of heavy API users, asked for stories, and I just want to share some of the quotes that people came back with in terms of what they've built. Like people using it very recently, like right now. So from redistricting to looking at influence networks around legislators, helping our, the bread and butter institutions of our society, school districts, folks who care about schools, connect with the policymaking process. Again, like stuff I'm really grateful to be working with. Okay, so that's Open States. What are some of the other actors who are working around data in this space, the space of policymaking broadly? Definitely there are some other organizations doing work. I want to call out and shout out those organizations. Open Secrets does money and politics super well, has a ton of structured data that is available in an open way for non-commercial use. Great resource. ProPublica does amazing journalism and research. If you don't follow them for their investigative journalism, I highly recommend that. Also, they have some data products that are freely available. So their Congress API, for instance, is a good resource. I'll also say Open States does have congressional data, so you can use us for both. And there's other organizations like Ballotpedia that isn't really data-oriented, but provides a lot of information. You can go to Ballotpedia to learn a lot about who's running for office, but doesn't have an open kind of structured data offering. Okay, what about legislative data? So in this area where Open States lives, like who else is doing what? Reality is there is a lot of closed legislative data. Lobbying for policy, trying to impact and understand policy is a big industry. A lot of dollars are at stake. A lot of money is spent on politics. You all know this. And so there are a lot of for-profit companies doing work in this space who are not contributing open data. And there's Open States, as I mentioned, is the truly open data in the space. So who contributes? Plural, we've been running the project. We'll talk more about the history in a second. Also GovHawk, another one of these for-profit companies doing work to create tools for people doing policy work. GovHawk has been important in making contributions regularly over the last few years. So it's a big difference. There are a lot of players, both old and new in the space, who do not contribute to open data, and really just a couple who do contribute to open data to kind of like sustain this effort. And I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader to think about these companies that are not contributing back. How many of them got their start starting with open states code? I'll let you think about that. So let's talk about Plural. Like, why are we here? Why are we invested in open data? Why did we make the choice to contribute and adopt this project? We're a venture capital funded startup, right? So we have big expectations to grow. Like, profit motive is definitely part of our story. But let's go back to our founders, Damola, Yemi, folks who back in 2015, 2016 looked around at a US politics landscape that was turbulent, a lot of troubling politics floating around, and decided to do something about it. And that was really the genesis of the company was, what can we do with software? How can we bring technology to the table to improve democracy, improve the ability for people to participate in democracy? The original idea was a little bit more of like a mobile app, didn't really get traction. By 2018, the founders pivoted to legislative data as a focus, having kind of learned and met people and learned about like what the pain points were out in the real world. Since then, we have grown a lot, and I'm very happy to still be here and have the opportunity to say we've grown a lot. We are now up to 39 people. We are a remote-first company. We have staff in the US primarily, also people in Nigeria, a member in Colombia. We're venture capital backed. We're an alum of the Techstars Accelerator. We raised a Series A in 2022, last year. And here are some of our investors. Right, so we're an interesting case. We're not a nonprofit. We're venture capital backed. People who are expecting us to grow and grow fast. And we're in this space of trying to do open data. And the story of how that came to be really started with an API key. So think back to 2018 when I mentioned we pivoted to legislative data. If you notice look at the code here, if you can see that back there, we started ingesting data from open states. So we started as a consumer of this open data. Open states, the fact that it existed at that point and was a mature project, gave us an opportunity to innovate. It would have been a lot harder for us to start up without open states data. Like for us to be able to be a democracy startup, the existence of open states was a huge boon. So our history of Plural with the open states timeline there, that code snippet I showed is about 2018. We adopted the project in 2021. And so from that point forward, open states is Plural, Plural is open states, right? We're the open states company. That's how it works. Why did we do that? How did that happen? Well, we had been using the project, contributing a small amount of money back to the project as a sustaining donation, more as a show of good faith, because we were in 2018, we're pre-seed, right? We don't have any money. And we're a startup, right? So we can't do a lot, but we're doing what we can. And then got this email, which was an email out to everybody on the open states mailing list with the announcement that the grants that had been running open states for the previous year and a half, 2 years, were going to run out. There wasn't funding around the corner. It wasn't obvious that the project was going to survive, and was really like a little bit of a plea from the founder to say, hey, please come forward, let's figure out how we keep this thing going. And that email for us was a decision point. We had a decision to make there. We could definitely privately fork the code and just keep doing what we're doing. And again, other actors in this space have made that choice, right? Just grab the code. You're not redistributing it. No one's going to catch you. Keep working on it. Run the scrapers privately. We could have done that, and not worried about the fate of the project. Or we could forge a new path. Try to do something just a little bit riskier, but also something that might provide opportunities that put us in a unique position, both to grow and also to make the social impact that we really care about. So this was our question, do we pull up the ladder behind us, the ladder that helped us get up and helped us become a startup, or are we going to try to like lift others as we climb up? So we decided to become an open data core company. And obviously open data core, I'm jumping off the open source core concept. It's loosely analogous, and I want to walk you through like how we think about that internally. We're going to do a diagram. At the bottom, the open data core. This is the foundation, right? So this is what the Open States project is it's truly open, structured data that is both, data that's available in a couple different formats, also a collection of open source web scrapers, a few other libraries that assist with the data scraping. And that's the foundation, right? This is how we're thinking about it is things like our, all of the millions of bills, sponsors, hearings, names of committees, people who are elected, that bulk data, the public API, and then the open source, like all this comprises our contribution to the commons, and it really matches what we think that every resident should have a right to under democracy. Like, you should have a right to understand and see into what government is doing. You should have a right to see the patterns, like it shouldn't, we know there are actors and organizations that have intentionally used opacity around policymaking to get stuff passed without people realizing it, to sneak stuff through. We think that's wrong, like that data should be available to everybody. And it's data that we can build things on top of, right? So first thing we built on top of, and this is, again, the Open States project, a lot of this existed by the time that we adopted the project, are public democracy tools. So the website, openstates.org, you can find your legislators. And that's something that, again, millions of people come to the site just to do that simple thing. You can learn about legislation, do simple searching and tracking. You can assemble, you got the bill tracking where you get updates. You can subscribe as an individual, tell me when this bill is moving and changing. So that's our public democracy tools. The other thing we're building is professional policy collaboration tools, right? We are a business. We are sustaining this. Our business model before we adopted the project, right, was building tools for professional policy teams. As I mentioned, it's a big market. A lot of people care about understanding and influencing legislation. So what's on that professional side, right? So support and onboarding, obviously. Organizing, sharing policy data into workspaces. So really, if you've got a professional team, you've got stakeholders, you're not just like kind of in a small citizens group or an individual. If you've got a team, we've got tools that make your life a lot easier to do policy work effectively. We see ourselves as really wanting to stop organizations, especially like small, medium-sized organizations, from spending a lot of time just copying data into spreadsheets, copying data into emails, right? Like all that grunt work is not you connecting with your constituency. We want you to be using your voice and the voices of your constituents. That should be what you're spending your time on, right? So that's our basic value proposition. Analysis for stakeholders, enterprise features, the usual. And the other thing we're building is advanced data insights, right? So this kind of also falls into that pro features bucket, which is we have a nascent data science effort. We're trying to build machine learning based features that help you understand, like if you're somebody especially who's working across the whole country, you've got a lot of bills, a lot of signal, and you've got to find, a lot of noise, and you've got to find signal in that noise. That's where our advanced insights come in. So we're going to like predict which bills have real momentum, identify relationships between bills that are not obvious. Big picture, get signal from all the noise, and there is a lot of noise in the legislative space. So you can have one state with 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 bills. Most of those bills are going nowhere. Some of those bills are going to generate a lot of heat, but not actually get traction behind the scenes. So advanced data insights is another part of what we offer that sustains the business. And we have revenue, we have paying customers. These are just logos we have on our website of people who are paying us for these professional tools. These are some of the folks who trust Plural to solve their problems. All right, so that's the Open Data Core model. And I want to give you some of the history so that you can compare different models, different chapters in the saga of open states that have made open states possible. And I want to give you an opportunity to kind of like draw your own conclusions about what models work, what the pros and cons are. So let's look back. It's almost 14 years now, and 14 years is a lot of years. Enough years to come up with some different variations on the logo. And going way back to 2009, it has its origins in just volunteer energy and that problem I mentioned early on of everybody could see that there was a lot of opacity around legislative data, that there was a real need for somebody to fix that. James Turk, the project's founder, just put a call out at a PyCon in 2009, expected a few volunteers, got even more volunteers, and that's what kicked this whole thing off, right? So it's a genesis in volunteer civic hacking energy. And that took them into the foundation era. So the Sunlight Foundation, Sunlight Labs adopted the project and gave it steady funding. So we're looking at right into 2010, continuing to build. So this is the early period of Open States as a serious project. So steady funding, augmenting that with Google Summer of Code, launching OpenStates.org for the first time around 2011, 2013 era. Going into the middle of the last decade, it was peak civic tech. You had a lot of people in the space trying startups, trying nonprofit stuff, the Code for America and Brigade stuff. Like there was a lot of energy. And there was this steady funding from the Sunlight Foundation that allowed the project to get pretty mature, which was really important. However, by 2016, Sunlight Labs closes in an abrupt way. It's just a way that surprised the folks on the ground who were working on this project. And with that, ended that foundation funding. So all of a sudden, the project's got an existential moment to figure out what to do. Next era, the independent era. So remember, this was a funded project. There were multiple people working on it. And those people kind of rallied to say, hey, let's keep this thing going. Let's find a way. Again, I mentioned GovHawk earlier. Tim Showers was really important in this period, coming in as somebody just building the business to say, hey, I want this to keep going. I'm going to contribute a little bit. Managed to keep releasing features through community supporters, did some more summer code stuff, focused on cost savings. Unfortunately, had to drop some of the historical data that the project had been carrying, which is a bummer. But tried to see all right, can we tighten our belt and keep this moving? Some of that contributor energy faded a little bit, but they were able to parlay it into a little bit more foundation funding. So there were just a couple grants that stabilized a smaller core team. They focused on maintainability, kind of doing things right for the future. Started to poke around we know these grants are going to run out. Can we build widgets and get paid for it? Can we do integration or contracting and somehow get paid for that to sustain this past those grants? And that was kind of where the question lay. But once again, I'll take you back to that email we got in late 2020. Those two grants ran out. Bring us right back to that moment of, once again, existentially, what's going to happen to the Open States project? And that's where Plural stepped in. So, all of that said, what model works? How do you sustain open data over the course of years? Now, obviously, in the open source community, we have these amazing open source foundations that can adopt projects, and especially projects where a lot of for-profit corporations are using that software. As hard as it is to get those corporations to contribute money for the maintenance of those projects, some of it does happen, right? There's some model for it. In the world of data for democracy, it's not quite as easy and clear-cut. There's not the same kind of license, community contributor dynamic. And so it's an open question. What model works to support open data where there's a compelling and huge public interest, a common good need for it? The reality, I think, is there's really no sure thing. There's no guarantee that your current model is going to last. There's no guarantee that someone's coming around the corner to save you, even for something that really looks necessary for the common good, for democracy. And just a few of those things, lessons learned, right, over looking back at that 13, 14-year story. And I want to apologize to James because I haven't told the story as well as he could, for sure. But this is me kind of coming in and having a few years of experience. I worked with James for a couple years and just sharing some things from my perspective, looking back at that history. So, foundation funding, obviously that didn't last. Open Civic Tech volunteer enthusiasm has waxed and waned. Right now, we're maybe at a little bit of a waned part. Like there are definitely people doing stuff locally, but that national energy for civic hacking is not at its peak. Progress on getting government to open up data. Believe me, it was a focus of the Open States project to try to rectify the underlying problem, which is that government didn't take responsibility, didn't have incentives to take responsibility for making open structured data available. James and others tried in a couple states in a very concerted way over a couple years to move policy and rule changes to make open data happen. And it was really disappointing, like straight up, it was just really disappointing. And I look around today and I still see no real incentive for state governments to really fix this problem. It just doesn't seem like it matters or improves the institutional decision makers' lives to make that data open and available, right? So the need is still there for us. Foundation funding, again, right? Like, well, you can keep dipping into that well, but it's never going to be an everlasting well. All it takes is for the philanthropic mood to change, and blam, it's gone, right? And I would say hope that with this being so important, that contributors just naturally step forward out of the woodwork. That happens with moments, but it's just not something you can count on overall. And finally, another thing that doesn't last is relying on a single person to shoulder a project for all these years. James persisted for a crazily long time, an impressive long time, bringing this project forward, but everybody needs space to grow and tackle a different problem eventually. But the bottom line is we're still here, which is great. And I think there's some things we can learn about how we came to still be here, right? How do we have the resilience? What do we learn? How do we keep changing? And that's the flip side, right? The determination of a single person really does matter, right? You can't count on it forever, but it really matters that one person was like, hey, this is important. I'm going to stick to this. Foundation funding when there's a mood fit, right? So as long as you do have that moment in time, if you're not putting all your eggs in that basket forever, like you can catch that as wind in your sails. Persistence of the problem helps us, right? Ironically, the fact that there's still this need and government is doing such a bad job of data means there is still a real need for us to exist and to keep expanding the work. And the willingness of just one or two commercial entities to take a path that's different than the absolute narrowest, most profit-driven path. And I mentioned, other actors who are in this space. Although that group of organizations, it's just two of us who have made this decision. And it's not like, oh, we're angels, we're going way out on a limb. We're just taking a path that's a little bit farther away from the very narrowest of like profit-motivated paths. And that makes a big difference. All right, so open gated core model. Let's talk a little bit about some of the promises and pitfalls with this model that we're trying right now. First of all, we've got to balance open and closed data, right? Like I mentioned, we're building professional policy team tools on top of this open data. Part of building those features results in some data points that are closed, right? I talked about some of those advanced data insights. That yields some data points that are not part of our open data set. And we've got to continue to balance open data with closed data as we move forward. And that's one of the challenges. Our North Star there is our values. Like I mentioned, our founders started with really clear values about improving democracy. It's built into our vision statement. It's built into the conversations we have all the time. So that's one factor we consider when balancing these. Another one is public interest, and that gets back to the problem being so compelling. We try to evaluate a class of data in terms of like, what does the average motivated person, what interest does that person have in this data? If this data is necessary to that kind audience to be able to engage effectively in democracy, then it has to be open, right? Even if we might want it to be otherwise. Like that's one of the tugs that we try to stick to. We try to keep that public interest pull part of our calculations. But of course, we're also considering cost and competition. If there's data that maybe there is a compelling public interest, but it costs us just so much work to get it. It's not as simple as turning a scraper on. We've got to recoup that cost somehow. We've got to think about how that allows us to compete, what our competitors have, but it also works both ways, right? One of the things we always say is there's certain data in this space that should be a commodity. It shouldn't be a moat. So data about who your legislator is, what bills are being introduced, that shouldn't be anybody's moat. And we think it gives us a competitive advantage to commoditize that, to put that out there and say, hey, none of our competitors get to use that as an advantage either. We're going to compete on the value of the products we build on top of it. We're going to compete in the market of we have the best tools. You're going to want to work with us because of that, not because we are grabbing some data that really should be public and keeping it as our own moat. But it's a continuing debate. This balancing act isn't simple. There's continual conversations within the company, with stakeholders. I can't promise you that this, in 5-10 years, gets to the most ideal outcome. But I believe in it, and I believe in trying it. All right, so I think we've made some progress. I think we've shown some evidence of the promise of this model. Again, a founding group with a different compass. We have a clear starting principle. Like from the very beginning of adopting open states, we decided, we are going to expand open data. We're not going to let that data stagnate. We are not going to take data off the table. Our bottom line is we're going to expand the open data. And it's just like a very distilled, simple starting point. It's helped guide our conversation. So I think having a really clear and simple guideline like that has helped a lot. And we're linking the public good problem to the private sector problem, right? Everybody's going to be lobbying for the rest of time. Politics doesn't stop. So there's an evergreen problem there, and I think if we can, and that problem is reflected both in terms of private interest as well as the common good. What we're trying to do is link those together so that we're solving the problem for that private problem that creates funds that then sustains our ability to solve that problem for the common good as well. And that means aligning the work that solves both. So as an engineer, I'm thinking about what are our data pipelines doing? How are we managing scrapers in a way that yields value to both sides of that equation as often as possible, right? I'm trying to avoid things that are weird branching edge cases that are clearly only in one case and not the other. Attracting values-aligned talent. We have very cool people working in the company. It's helped us find very cool people to work with. So that's a definite win and shows promise for this model. It's like we get an advantage in the marketplace finding people to join up. And open data connects us to growth opportunities. So we get to have conversations with people. Yeah, you saw some of those logos at the beginning of the talk of organizations using our data, relying on our data. We get to talk to those folks in a way where they're like, yeah, you're providing this opportunity to us. And we can say, hey, we can save your engineers a lot of time. Instead of running data pipelines and moving this data, use our tools, the stuff we've already built, pay us a little bit. You get to save their time, focus your technical team's time on just the analysis, just the advanced stuff, the extra value you want to get out of it. And finally, there's a lead investor here that gets it. Our lead investor in our Series A is S3 Ventures. They have a single limited partner. This is a firm that has a little bit more of a reputation, a track record of being kind of a steady, slightly longer term view, right? Venture capital gets a bad rap, oftentimes for good reason. And our CEO has done a tremendous amount of work to steer us to investors that are going to be good partners for us. It wouldn't work with just anybody. And I just want to say, next up, this is something we can do as a growth-oriented and VC-backed company that if OpenStates had stayed that 1 or 2 person team, we couldn't do, which is look at new places to solve problems. And a place we're working right now is several countries in Africa. We're doing data work. We don't have anything to announce or release today, but we will this year. There are places where we can bring the technology that we've already built and connect to the problem to create transparency. Our VP of Africa, Obina Osisogu, is building those connections on the ground, right? And so we're doing this in an authentic way with people who are experiencing the problems of government opacity in a day-to-day way. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges and risks. First up, obviously there is pressure against the cost center analysis, right? Like it's easy for, if you're an investor, to look at this open data as a cost center. We are always pushing back against that, doing the work to align it. And think about, when we're from that venture capital fund, like we're talking about exits, right? The lens is like, well, how are we going to exit? Are we going to get to an IPO? Are we going to get acquired? Do we just go bust? For most startups, most are going to fail or get sold to another company. And if that happens, I can't guarantee what the outcome will be for the next stage in the open state saga. I do think the one thing we're sticking to is by continuing to open source the scrapers, the underlying code that generates this data. Like at least the community has that guarantee that if something like that happens, somebody can start that next chapter, have that code as a starting place, right? We're not taking that off the table. We're not going to build up this big kind of dark mountain of code that then makes it impossible for the project to continue. But there's definitely a risk reward here, right? The reward is that we can take the problem that we managed to solve in the US around legislative data and find other places where they're experiencing that problem right now and make a much bigger impact. The risk is, well, a lot of startups fail. So that means constant strategy and consensus building to negotiate the way between open data, closed data, and keeping things aligned. Oops. So I want to leave you with a thought and a challenge. Now we're here at an open source conference. So a lot of you are probably already doing this work, but look, I think there are special things about our company, but we're not magical. If Plural could make the decision to say, hey, you know what, we're going to take a little bit of a riskier path, we're going to contribute back. And if that kind of decision, whether it's us, whether it's GovHawk, if that kind of decision, we can look back and see the impact to sustaining open data over the years, then that means that your company can do the same thing. So think about that. Is there data that your organization, your company touches that could be open? Is there data you rely on that is open today that you could make even just some contribution in? I look around at the landscape, and again, we are not at peak civic tech right now. There's not an incredible outpouring of energy. Foundations have moved to COVID, and now they're moving to other problems. It is on us to make projects like this happen. All right, with that said, I'd love to connect with you, talk about how our open data can benefit projects you're working on. If you're in data, that's your trade, let's talk about and start a relationship. Maybe you can join up someday. And if you're doing policy work, certainly, if you got a policy team, you know people who are doing policy work, and maybe you want to make sure they're using tools that help go back into supporting open data, let's make sure we get them hooked up with a demo for Plural. With that said, did I go over by 10 minutes?
No.
Oh, no, it's 11:30. Okay. So we got a good 20 minutes for questions.
Yeah, you did. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to present.
So I have a few different questions, and I'll start maybe with one or two. So after adopting the project, what does the external contributor community look like right now? Is it mostly, Plural that's carrying the entire thing, or is there still a lot of engagement with other just volunteer contributors?
Yeah, that's a great question. The contributor community had kind of withered even before we adopted it, and so we kind of adopted it at a sort of low point. Riley, I don't know how, a few years ago, there were 3 or 4 people, what'd you say? Yeah, not many, right? We're trying to revive that a little bit. I would say Plural is, and GovHawk, right? Tim from their team contributes code on a regular basis. But I think we're carrying most of the load right now. Operationally, we're doing everything. We have the bulk of the new commits on repositories, but we're trying to breathe some life into it a little bit. We had that summit earlier this year, had a hackathon, so we had a good 10 new people come in as contributors. It's not I would love to learn more about like how to grow that in an effective way and like not a super time-intensive way. So if anybody here wants to talk about that afterwards, I'd love to hear tips. But yeah, I think right now we're mostly carrying the load.
And then my next question, as far as the data, is it primarily centered around like kind of the policy and bills, or are there other components with different types of open government data, like, you know, street data or park data or other types of stats like that?
Yeah, we're really focused on bills and the like policy-making process, and we probably will be for the near term, as that's kind of like the problem we know how to solve, and we think there are other places where we can help solve that problem. But we're very interested in the long term in kind of forming leadership around just like policy generally, like policy intelligence, which means having to understand the impact of policies, whether that's from what other government agencies are doing in a result of policy, how people are impacted. So in the long term, I would love to be doing that kind of data. And I haven't really found something that looks to me like a hub for discovering that kind of data. I've seen a ton of like individual isolated projects, you know, whether that's a dashboard from a government agency or a citizen group that's like mapping Chicago bus timeliness. Like I see those projects, but I haven't seen a single big place to discover and like make those interoperable. I don't know if you've heard of anything like that, but that's kind of what I've got my eye out looking out for.
This city has their own data portal, and a lot of these others have. I think there have been maybe a few out there, but none that I know of offhand. I guess my last question is, with all of the data, how do you deal with the problem of, I guess, the accuracy or integrity of different formats coming in from different places, or is that part of the key thing that OpenStates is working on, is having a consistent framework or schema for what policy data might look like coming in from all these sources?
Yeah, absolutely. You got it right on the nose. It is a huge challenge. My colleague Riley fights that fight day to day. So, yeah, it's the Wild West. Like, we can't rely on these websites to do anything, even just existing from day to day sometimes. So a lot of work goes into from like code that sets that structure at the scraper level and validates the incoming data, to pipeline code that we do to try to make sure we know that it's still flowing and see anomalies, to end-to-end reporting where we're just keeping track of counts and doing little scout scrapes to see if it seems like anything's missing. But we also rely on people to let us know, because it is a ton of data points that can change arbitrarily without any guarantee. So yeah, the data quality problem is a very real and serious one, given that we're scraping a lot of this data just from random websites. Thank you.
Well, if nobody else has a question, I have a question. Are you guys using any sort of Hugging Face model or anything like that to do intelligent document processing, to like go through the bills and try to pull out nuggets of, contradictions between different versions or anything like that?
Yeah, sorry, you said what kind of base model?
Like Hugging Face, like any of the Hugging Face models, like question answering you can get, or just any sort of synopsis creation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're experimenting with that right now. We're really excited about that. I don't have like a proof of concept to show off yet, but our lead data scientist is working on like summarization of changes right now, trying to tackle that. It's really cool. I really hope we find ways to make it work, and because, yeah, like so many of these people who are doing day-to-day policy work are just reading bills, just like scanning through hundreds of pages to find out like, is the change in here or not that I care about? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm hoping we will see some like kind of like publications and proof of concepts that we can share over the course of this summer.
Very cool. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Just kidding.
So, getting on a more granular level for the states, is there an onboarding or a process, like you mentioned city council, right, to be able to take and plug in, the open states stuff to say, hey, can I point this at my city to see what all these different bills and things that are getting discussed and passed on a local level? Because I'm sure that's kind of an doubly exponential thing to go from the 50 states to however millions and millions of different districts are out there. Yeah,
hundreds of cities, thousands of counties, right? There's that whole layer. and we do, I mean, technically the infrastructure is there if somebody was motivated and said, like, hey, I want to pull in essentially like ordinances from LA. Like you can go into our OpenState scrapers repository and write a scraper for that using this documentation that'll guide you through like what the format needs to be on the other end. That said, it's not like we have anything that's super automated or helps like structure that for people who are totally new. So I think it's an area of growth for us. And also the problem is a lot of the city and county stuff like is just like embedded in like agenda documents and PDFs. So this becomes like an even harder parsing problem than a typical like legislative website where we're dealing with HTML tables and it's relatively easy to like select a structure out of there. So I think that's actually the bigger problem is how much of the local and county stuff is embedded in documents, and we don't have a super like starter friendly way to interact with that interface yet.
All right, well, no further questions. Thank you very much again.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate you being here.